If you ask, in what way did queer people impact the Harlem Renaissance, one might say that it couldn't have existed without them, without us.
The thing that struck me was the discovery that the most luminous luminaries of the Harlem Renaissance were all gay and lesbian.
To be black and gay, to be a double negative in America, is more than a notion and was like being a part of a secret society.
And that's one of the things that makes this so interesting to me, is that it is both the first time in American history when you have African Americans and whites interacting in a non-clandestine way.
Something thrilling was happening in New York City at the dawn of the 20th century. Thousands of black folks made their way to a redeveloping neighborhood called Harlem, and a cultural revolution was born. The Harlem Renaissance, or the New Negro Movement as it was often referred to at the time, produced monumental works from poets, singers, artists, and intellectuals. Langston Hughes, Josephine Baker, Count Basie, and Billie Holiday were just some of the visionaries who gave voice to black identity and illuminated the struggles of a segregated world. While many people know about the works and figures of the Harlem Renaissance, what is less widely known is how many of those luminaries were queer, and how their queerness not only informed their work, but contributed greatly to the impact of such a formative period in American consciousness. Harlem historian Michael Henry Adams tells us how the oft-forgotten queer history of the Harlem Renaissance is inseparable from the achievements of the movement. I'm Peppermint, and this isn't just our history, this is legendary.
If you ask, in what way did queer people impact the Harlem Renaissance, one might say that it couldn't have existed without them, without us. Gay people, I think, because of the opportunity that Harlem represented, and also because of having some knowledge that there were other gay people here, were inclined to flock here, to try to discover community and to make common cause. And so this concentration of people meant that some of the brightest lights of the Harlem Renaissance were gay. So, of course, near the top of the list is Langston Hughes, and then you have Countee Cullen, his friend, the poet, and then you have Wallace Thurman, who was a novelist. So much of the biases and racism that exist in the broader culture exists amongst gay people. One did have this kind of situation where, irrespective of race, being gay and lesbian was like being a part of a secret society. The thing of it is, when you're talking about African Americans who are gay, they've all got some relation who desperately want them to be straight. And so there are even people who try to infer that James Baldwin is straight. There's Langston Hughes' descendants who tried to infer that he was straight. And then there are these people, they try to infer that Dorothy West was straight. I'm interested in landmarks that represent not just people of color, but also LGBTQ plus people, because both groups are the same in terms of the fact that with marginalized people, you tend to have our history eviscerated, erased. And there are no more tangible reminders of history, I think, than buildings where people lived and loved and worked and worshiped. And therefore, for people to be able to see these places where the greats of the past lived is, I think, very impactful. New York, 130-odd years ago, was as racist and segregated as every other part of America. And after the riot of 1900 in West Side of New York, a lot of African Americans who lived on the West Side, as a consequence of the riot, wanted to move somewhere else. And then you had Harlem, which, in anticipation of the Broadway IRT subway, which was first announced in the 1890s, In anticipation of the completion of the subway, you had all these developers who were building new tenement buildings and new first-class apartment houses, anticipating that for the first time, you could have working-class people live at some distance from where they lived and economically be able to get to work quickly. Black people came to Harlem in such vast numbers, with it being estimated that, by 1920, there was somewhere around 500,000 African Americans living in Harlem, that it was appreciated by just about everyone that Harlem would remain a Black community for the foreseeable future. Many historians reckon that the Harlem Renaissance, which at the time was usually referred to as the Negro Renaissance of the new Negro. Most historians say, well, that occurred in 1925, and it occurred specifically because Alain Leroy Locke, this African-American gay philosopher who headed the philosophy department at Howard University, that he edited a Harlem issue of this magazine called Survey Graphic. Most of the contributors were Black, and all of the contributions were about Black people in Harlem. And then in 21, I think it is, you had the Broadway musical, Shuffle Along, that opened in Harlem. Many people say that that is the event that launched the Negro Renaissance, from whites coming to Harlem to see the show and to become entranced by jazz and wanting to venture to that wild side that was Harlem, to experience sex, drugs, and rock and roll, except rock and roll was jazz. African-American clergymen were just revolted by all of the prostitution and gambling and drinking that was allowed to occur in Harlem. And they, preached against it. They said that white people like to come to Harlem in order to give their morals a vacation. They complained bitterly about all the nightclubs like the Cotton Club that opened up there, and all of the gay clubs that opened up on West 133rd Street between 5th and 6th Avenues. But on the adverse side of the coin, there was the reality that those illicit clubs provided venues for African-American entertainers and brought to light the talents of Andy Rassaf and Josephine Baker and Lena Horne and Billie Holiday, the singer Jimmy Daniels. So, but for the Cotton Club or the Alhambra or the Clam House, there would be no Gladys Bentley, there would be no Moms Mabley.
Who's the wolf?
It's Billy. He's the owner of the club.
Why they call him the wolf?
Because he eats his own kind.
What that mean?
One of the difficulties that queer African Americans have is, in essence, reclaiming our history, reclaiming a history which many African Americans would like to obliterate, that we embarrass them. To be Black and gay, to be a double negative in America, is more than a notion. For me, these figures who lived in Homo Harlem are just so heroic as well as exemplary, because they managed to share their truth despite all of the compulsion to do otherwise. Sometimes, like Langston Hughes and Dorothy West, they managed to do it without getting married, for instance, and passing in that way. Sometimes, like Richard Bruce Nugent or Countee Cullen, marrying someone and having an accommodation made it easier for them to be their true selves. So I'm very proud to be descended from such people who had such a great impact on the world that they're still being talked about today. Perhaps the most famous gay venue in Harlem was the yearly masquerade ball given by the Hamilton Lodge Oddfellows. But this was one night where, because the Hamilton Lodge Oddfellows would get a license from the police, where people could come and fulfill their greatest, one might even put it, fulfill their greatest reality and be who they were or who they wanted to be. Locally in Harlem, it was referred to as the Faggots Ball, and people would gather in crowds to watch as limousines would drive up. You know, these black queers, they were very clever. If they had friends who worked for undertakers, they would borrow their limousines to drive people. The moment the ball was over, they would begin saving up and collecting things to make their costume for the next year.
I don't know how it's done happen.
One of the things that's fascinating for me as an historian is how, you go back in history and what do you discover? Well, the most interesting thing you discover when you look at the past is you discover yourself. We're all very vain and egocentric, and we almost imagine that no one like us ever lived before. But you go and you look in history and you find there you are, and people like you who lived before and were motivated in the same sort of way.